I suck at this skill, which is why when I audited another DM's game and offered feedback, it stood out how good they were at it. I'm talking about dialogue in combat, and there is a surprising amount of depth to the reasons why this is an important skill for us to manage, no matter how underappreciated it is. And thankfully, a number of different ways that we can go about trying to improve it. For a long time, there's been kind of a debate between the realism camp and the entertainment camp when it comes to combat dialogue. Essentially, realists are of the opinion that if you are talking a whole bunch in combat, that you're taking away from the actual feel of a fight and how it should go, whereas the entertainment camp are perhaps willing to sit through long combat soliloquies in order to have a anime-like monologuing feel to their game because they think it's fun and they don't really care about the whole realism thing. I've always sort of fell more into the realism camp than into the entertainment camp, but I think that there's quite a spectrum of room there for us to set the sweet spot for our particular games. And having seen it in play at a few different tables with different DMs, I have to say that I think that I'm starting to lean much more towards the middle than I used to. And there's a number of reasons why I think that combat dialogue is a super important skill. The first doesn't necessarily apply to every combat, but just as in modern games, combat should generally be driving you towards the story that you're trying to tell, combat dialogue also has that opportunity to tell a little bit more of the story. We learn a little bit about the participants, we learn a little bit about what might be coming next if our opponents and villains and minions are talking during the fight and telling us useful things. It's an opportunity for us to push the story forward just a little bit by showing the relationships that are involved and or by offering threats that deliver a little bit of information in the sort of villain monologuing style, even if we keep it nice and brief in order to lean a little towards the realism camp. But perhaps more important in my mind is the second reason, which is how combat dialogue helps to take what is by force a mechanically crunchy portion of our Dungeons and Dragons game and bring it down into more of a narrative experience. By speaking in combat and having those conversational quips, even if it's just insults hurled back and forth, we help to ground people in the narrative of the combat that's happening instead of just paying attention to the d20 here and the damage roll there that are being rolled repeatedly throughout the game. Bringing people out of the mechanics and into the world is almost always the primary focus of good dungeon mastery. A third thing that can be useful for combat dialogue is how it will help us to foreshadow inside of combat. If you're ever looking for a way to just simply level up your combat, all it takes is to tell your players a couple of initiatives ahead what is going to be happening. The raised axe for a deadly swing on a person, the beginnings of spell casting with a trace of fire around the fingertips of the person casting. Anything that gives those little hints to your players as to what is coming next is a great combat addition in order to enhance the feel of the game and give more meaningful choices. And combat dialogue is another tool that makes that incredibly possible, as the leader of the group might identify themselves by calling out commands to various people upon the field. They might tell somebody to go and get reinforcements, which more than any kind of action is going to spur people into switching targets to the guy who's running for the next room full of bad guys. Or it might be as simple as calling for an extra quiver of arrows, or asking somebody to throw the healing potion over, or telling them who that they should be attacking so that the group will target together. Having those opportunities for dialogue to tell the tactics that are going to take place gives your players a lot of information to work with and makes a lot of narrative sense. And that's kind of the fourth item on the list of reasons why dialogue's awesome as well, and that's that it takes the tactics that your monsters are using from out of character realm and grounds them into a role-played perspective. Even if it's just dialogue a la a growl, a snarl, and eyes narrowing towards somebody, the words of "you'll pay for that" from a certain creature, or or anything of that ilk. It helps to ground the group, and it tells the tactics that they're going to use from the perspective of their characters instead of from this God's eye third-person view up in the sky looking down upon what's happening. But of course, since I kind of suck at this skill, the big question is how can we improve? And so here's a couple of things that I have tried, am trying, or intend to try. The first is as simple as writing combat dialogue on a sticky note and slapping it on the inside of my DMing screen, and creating a little 3x5 that just has dots lined up on it for combat dialogue that I can run an X through every time one of my monsters or creatures says something in the midst of initiative. It's a proven fact that what we track is what we improve, and so I'm going to track combat dialogue in order to improve at it. And the next is to add a new list of 10 to my preparation. Having ripped lists of 10 wholesale from Mike Shea over at Sly Flourish, this is just another inclusion into my prep that I'm going to work towards, of putting down 10 bullet points and quickly jotting out some combat dialogue that seems appropriate to encounters that the group are likely to come up against. I may not use any of these verbatim, but they'll give me an improv prompt to work from and let me cross them out as I use them so that I can see how useful some were or weren't, and I'll be able to improve this list by writing a fresh one every session for every campaign that I run, and it should only take me 5 minutes extra to be able to create them. Lists like this are just flat out invaluable. The third thing that I've done to improve my combat dialogue is added a space on my initiative tracker for dialogue specifically. Kind of like a layer action that always happens at initiative 20, at a certain point on my initiative, usually right around the middle, I'm going to include this spot that just tells me say something, and at that spot my monsters or creatures will have to have some kind of opportunity to speak up. If I include this in every combat, then I know that I'll at least speak up once around to improve my combat dialogue from where it's at. If it comes naturally and is easy for you to do so when these prompts come up, then you can include multiple of them, or even include them at the end of every monster's turn or the like, but just having that extra little reminder to speak up once or twice around, I think, is enough to elevate combat dialogue for me. The fourth option for combat dialogue improvement comes down to knowing the personalities of the monsters and NPCs that are going to engage in combat. That means preparing for those combats by preparing the personalities more deeply than you might otherwise. This can be tough when it feels like it's going to be a throwaway character that is only going to be portraying that personality during the middle of a fight, but if you can get a random list of 10 or 20 different quick personality traits with a quirk, an accent, and maybe a flaw or motivation, and then have those listed out and cross them off as you use them in combat, then you can provide a differentiator between Goblin number 1 and Goblin number 3, or the like, no matter how many opponents you have on the field, simply by trying to dive into this quick little list of personalities. Creating that extra work beforehand doesn't have to go to waste if you haven't assigned them to any specific creature, and then obviously for those NPCs and monsters who play a larger part in your story, you should be delving into their personalities anyway in order to make them as memorable and as real as possible. Fifth and finally, we can start to take a look at where combat dialogue makes sense, not only in our games but also in other media that we might be consuming. Some of the most likely spots are in situations where the tactics are going to change on the battlefield, moving from a all-out blitz to a defensive retreat or vis-a-vis is obviously a point where communication between the participants is likely to happen. In every good action movie and in Dungeons & Dragons, when the action is building is a great time to include combat dialogue as well. Whether that's because there's reinforcements coming or the second stage of a fight, or because somebody is in great danger, when the action builds, it's time to talk. Sometimes that's also because there is some form of natural pause created. When somebody is knocked back and prone, there's a natural opportunity for some kind of one-liner quip from the person doing the knocking. When somebody's disarmed or badly injured, there can feel like a natural pause where some kind of word exchange is plausible. Or when somebody is forced to dash forward in combat or use the dodge action and doesn't otherwise get to exert themselves in the usual swingy fashion, this is another natural pause where a little combat dialogue can elevate their action. And finally, look for any moments where there's going to be that impactful scene that could have a real influence upon your player characters. Death scenes are some of the most classic examples of this, as the final words of the person who's already been defeated are uttered before they pass away. If you're like me and this is a skill that you want to work on, then pick up my after action template so that you can ask yourself after every fight whether or not you talked enough while you were having the stuffing knocked out of your monsters. This is it. You've officially watched all the way to the end and are now my favorite. If you want to do me a favor, then hit share or else watch this video next. Thanks so much for watching. Happy adventuring.